Okay, so thanks for coming. My name is Louise Wheeler and I'm a doctoral research student from the University of Birmingham School of Education. At the moment I'm actually doing a PhD looking at English language learning in Kazakhstan, but this morning I'd like to talk to you about my master's dissertation research project, which was an ethnographic study looking at literacy, language learning and agency in a small language school in the UK. And I'm going to talk about one particular set of learner literacy practices, which was referred to as one of my participants as saving, so I'll come on to that later. So firstly, if I could just tell you something about how the study developed. My own background is as an English as a foreign language teacher, and before coming to do my MA in TEFL at Birmingham, I was working at a small language school, here we are down here, in the UK, and in that job I was working with a number of Arabic speaking learners, generally at low levels, who I noticed were having trouble developing reading and writing skills in English. And I was curious as to why this might be, because it wasn't just a problem in and of itself, it was leading to the students becoming very frustrated that they weren't making the same progress as their peers. And also it was inhibiting the extent to which they could study autonomously outside of the classroom. So I had a look at the previous research that had been done on second language literacy acquisition, particularly among Arabic speakers, and I came across a number of psycholinguistic and cognitive studies that pointed to differences in orthography between Arabic and English as a possible problem, or that some students had difficulty in developing phonological awareness, so the relationship between how words look and how they sound. And while doubtless these factors are involved in the process of second language acquisition, I wasn't satisfied that this was the whole story. For one, I had quite a number of Japanese and Korean students who also came from linguistic backgrounds that used a different writing system, but weren't experiencing the same problems. And also, I felt that for all that the experimental research gave us interesting insights into what's going on cognitively when people write, it wasn't telling us anything about the processes by which literacy develops. So I wanted to focus the study particularly on the social processes through which second language literacy develops. And this led me to socio-cultural theory as a useful theoretical framework for exploring this, looking at language learning as occurring in social interaction mediated by texts and by expert language users such as teachers. However, it wasn't until I actually started to collect my data that agency emerged as a particularly salient theme. One, the data threw up a number of invisible learner literacy practices, to use Mike Bainham's term. These were things that learners were doing with literacy that weren't being acknowledged in the classroom. And also the participants themselves, often both teachers and students, made links between literacy and agency and learning autonomously. So this was something that I followed up. So a socio-cultural perspective of language learning takes into account the social, historical and cultural aspects that shape the context of learning. So I needed a concept of agency that did the same. So I was looking at agency not as something that people have, but as a social process, as a social practice, i.e. something that people do, what they think about it and the values that they ascribe to that. And Raeln has conceptualised agency as the socio-culturally mediated capacity to act. And similarly, Birch talks about an agent as being a person acting with mediational means. And for me, I found that this focus on mediation was particularly useful for looking at literacy. If I can ask you to look at the diagram from Daniel's here, thinking about the way that the learner learns about the social world as mediated through texts and through the teacher, and the classroom environment brings these two kinds of mediation together. So I was interested in exploring how these two things are related. Van Leer takes Raeln's socio-cultural agency concept one step further and operationalises it for research in looking at agency in language learning classrooms by outlining three aspects. One, that agency involves initiative and self-regulation. That agency is always mediated by the cultural context, always socially motivated and will be socially interpreted. And thirdly, it involves being conscious of the effects of your own actions on the social environment and on others. So just as I was looking for a socio-cultural concept of agency, I was looking for an idea of literacy that allowed me to think in the same terms. And Barton and Hamilton, I found their idea of literacy practices quite useful in this respect. And they have 6 aspects outlining what a literacy practice is. This is again literacy as a social process, what people do, think about, and how they value literacy. So first of all, it can be inferred from events which are mediated by written text. So the idea that you can't separate literacy from the context in which it's used. It's important to look at it in specific real-world situations. Also that there are different literacies associated with different domains of life. There's no one universal, neutral idea of what literacy is. It will mean different things to different people in different situations. That literacy is patterned by institutions and power relationships was something that I thought would be quite important when looking at literacy in the language classroom and how pedagogy might create or constrain opportunities for agency development. That literacy practices are embedded in social goals and cultural practices. So what we're doing in our classrooms is not just contained there, it's related to what's happening in the wider society outside. That literacy is socially situated, so remembering that our learners come to us with past experiences that have shaped what they're doing with literacy, why they're learning a language and what they think about it. And lastly, that literacy practices change and that new ones are frequently acquired. So I was interested to use an ethnographic approach that allowed me to look at how things changed over time rather than taking a static snapshot. So this is kind of my theoretical framework which I was looking at the study within. So to tell you just briefly about the research design methodology, as I've mentioned before, I took an ethnographic case study approach that was based at Riverton Language School, which is a pseudonym by the way, the same school that I used to work in. And for all that I was focused on language classrooms, it was a multi-sited approach, so it was also looking at other contexts outside the classroom, like student social areas, staff rooms, homes of the students on a few occasions. I had 5 key learner participants, all Arabic-speaking learners, and also teachers and staff at the school. And I adopted an ethnographic approach partly because I wanted to investigate holistically the complexity of the relationships that go on between agency and literacy in the classroom. And also, again, coming back to Barton and Hamilton's idea of looking at literacy in specific real-world settings to find out what they mean in that particular context. And having the aim, going back to what the ladies this morning were saying, of trying to represent the perspectives or the voices of the participants involved, rather than coming to the study with preconceived ideas of what literacy should mean or does mean. And I hope that this would allow the study to question traditional dominant assumptions about the value and effects of certain literacy practices, particularly within education. So my data was collected over 8-day-long visits over 8 weeks and comprised a number of ethnographic methods such as participant observation and field notes of classes, semi-structured interviews with teachers and students, audio recording of classroom interaction and interviews, and also very importantly documentary evidence. So this was things like student work, board work practices, photocopies of textbooks, anything literacy based that was going to pattern what was happening in the classroom. When it came to the analysis stage though, it was important to try and integrate these 3 different sets of data. And I did this by going back to the framework that Barton and Hamilton had of literacy practices and Van Leer's idea of agency as a social practice. And I used these 2 frameworks to try and identify literacy practices that were related to agency and also to identify particular aspects of the data set to focus on more closely in analysis. So my discussion today is going to focus on the learner literacy practice of one key participant, and it was a literacy practice he himself referred to as saving. Just to give you a bit of background about this particular learner, he was in his 20s, he was a Saudi Arabian guy who came here probably when he was sort of beginner elementary level in English. And he was here for about 9 months altogether. So his saving practice, or practices, basically to outline them, basically what he did was he would copy new vocabulary from the board in class into his notebook. He would reread these notes at home, translating them with an electronic dictionary. Then he would transfer them into this photocopied grid, which he prepared himself, and write each one out 10 times while repeating them aloud. And what was particularly interesting about this was how important he thought it was for his own language learning. He repeatedly told me throughout the study, not write, not save. So give me an idea of the value that he puts on this particular practice of literacy. He told me, these all new words, I go home today, save, I think this tomorrow, I know. So he's got this connection for him between saving this set of practices and really knowing the language. And also I think the idea of saving itself came up as an active agency within the study. I'm an English language teacher, so originally when he was using the word save, I thought, oh, he's making a mistake. He means learn, he means study or memorise. So I offered him these alternatives within the interview. But he was resisting my offer of different vocabulary, which was unusual for this learner, who had asked me to correct him and quite often uptook the corrections that I made. So for example, here he's telling me, this more book, save new words. And I offer, remember, you know, now talk 3 words Arabic. I was trying to learn Arabic at the time. Yes, save new words Arabic, save new words Arabic, talk Arabic. So he's really resisting my offer of different vocabulary here. And throughout the 8 weeks of the study, we actually, I think, came to negotiate a very particular meaning for this word save as a particular set of practices with a particular set of beliefs attached to them. So if we consider saving in socio-cultural terms then, it's mediating second language learning in 2 ways. Firstly, spatially, it's allowing new language that's coming up in the classroom to be available for language learning at home. And secondly, it's involved in the process of internalisation. We think in terms of Vygotsky's ideas of proximal development. This is language that's available for the student which he can use with the help of a teacher or the support of a text. It's allowing him to internalise that to actual development, or what he talks about as really knowing the language that he can then use to pursue his own language learning goals. So I see it very much as an active learner initiative that's based on his past experiences of language learning in Saudi Arabia. So as has been highlighted before, it's important to understand social practice of agency and literacy in context. However, the context changes over time, and so the practices of learning have to change as well. What Dorothy Holland et al. Talk about is improvisations. And this is illustrated by a particular problem of what this learner called special words that came up in this 2nd week of interviews. So this was the 2nd week interview, and the learner was showing me his notebook where he'd written a lot of new words from a recent class. So D is the student and L is me. So the student says, I save this and this and this. You know, one class speak, save this now, this all new, okay? Okay. Today I know not more. 2nd class, same all. Another one? Yes, 3rd class, same, this no. So he's telling me he's had 3 classes today. Each has been producing a lot of new vocabulary he's had to put in his book. So it's good to do everything in class and then go home to memorise it. Yes, but the problem, small problem, 20 words, I go home, where is save? Where is no save? Save okay, but I can't save one class 20 words, you know? So he's realised that now his saving practice, it works, but he's got too much vocabulary that's coming up in class for him to be able to use it effectively. And I agree with him. It's too much. Yes, but 10 words special. Okay, I'm interested to know what he means by special. I don't know where is special, you know? Okay. Any teacher write in the rights, and then his wife, who's also with him in the interview, says 10 words. 10 words, but I don't know what is special. This me better English save, and next I know. So what's coming up here, and came up in other interviews as well, was that he knew that some words were what he called special, and I got the impression this meant words that were going to help him to communicate more effectively in English, which was his priority for being in England. However, since he'd arrived, he'd made fantastic progress, and now, you can't see this terribly well, but now his classes were producing much more new vocabulary than they had in the early stages. Too much for him to incorporate this into his saving practice so he could go home and learn things. And he wasn't yet in the position to make the decisions himself about what was special and what wasn't. So I've mentioned Holland et al.'s idea of improvisation, which they talk about how learners draw on cultural and social resources available to simultaneously transform the social landscape and intimate terrain of inner speech. So here, this student is aware that the social language, the context of learning has changed, and now different resources, more languages available to him, and that he needs to transform into the intimate terrain through his his saving practices, but he's aware that he can't yet do this. Having said that, in a later interview, he does seem to have modified his practice to deal with this problem. So here he told me, some word I save, but some word I save that you know, okay, but some word new I write. Okay, so if it's something you don't know, if it's something you know, you don't write it. No, I write, but not save. Same I ask you, so he shows me this list of words he's got in his book in both English and Arabic. Here I check the new words I know, but I want something, anything read. Sometimes I know another, check with the, with the repeat, check with the sentence, and this you know. So what he was telling me here, this is a short excerpt from a very long conversation, but what emerged was that he had, he'd found distinctions. So there were words that he already knew, which he would copy down because that was what he did with words on the board. There were special words that he would copy down and go and save at home. And then there was the other vocabulary which might also be important, but that he wouldn't go to the trouble of saving. He'd put it in his book so he could refer back to it if he needed it, but he wasn't going to go to the trouble of going through the whole saving practice at home. And there were many other examples throughout the study of ways in which this learner improvised his learning practice in response to the changing context of learning. However, in focusing on learner agency, it's important to remember that literacy practices are patterned by social relations of power, and so classroom practice may constrain the possibilities of agency development. So to do this, I looked at teachers' board work practices. And in interviews and observations, I saw, not surprisingly, that teacher board work practices were intended to facilitate learners' language learning goals. Got a list of things that teachers talked about here. However, as we've seen before, board work was a crucial part of students' saving practice. In fact, that was how he judged the value of words to be saved. But it also led to problems. We've talked about special words today, as one example. So although board work was intended to increase student autonomy by allowing him to take words home in his book, it possibly was inhibiting agency development by reinforcing the attitude that institutional practices from the teacher were more valuable than those he develops independently. I came across a striking example of this early on in the study when I visited the student at his home, and he had labelled everything in English, furniture, everything in his kitchen. And I asked him about this in a later conversation, which I won't go through here. But basically, I was struck by this improvisation of transforming his entire house into a saving literacy practice. And I see this possibly as him making his home more like the classroom. The classroom that's patterned by literacy, possibly even defined by literacy, in which language there is seen as legitimate. So by using literacy practices, he transfers the legitimacy of language in the classroom to language learning at home. However, there was no mechanism for language at home to come back into the classroom, what Mike Bainham talks about as bringing the outside in. So, and learners did have access to other English language texts, novels, websites, bills he got to his flat, but these were never included in saving practices or in the classroom discourse. So I would argue that they were not open to legitimacy communicated through the classroom, and so were less likely to become tools for mediating language learning, potentially closing off opportunities for the development of agency in second language by diminishing the value of initiative taking. So just to conclude briefly, some implications for researching agency in educational contexts and also for language teaching. So firstly, I would say that incorporating a socio-cultural perspective of agency may enable researchers to see language practices in a different way. For example, saving, which I may have mistook for simply a vocabulary problem, or and therefore I wouldn't have seen the way that the improvisations were evolving over time. Also, development of literacy practices and agency in language learning, we've seen, are intimately linked. And the focus on literacy practices has shown how agency and language learning develop and change over time, shaped by past experiences, future aspirations, constraints, and opportunities. And my last point would be, just to come back to Van Leer, that not all acts of agency are conducive to language learning. And it's very important that the expert knowledge of the teacher can help to foster and shape practices in ways that makes learning more effective. So I think there's a great deal of potential in making learner literacy practices and learner agency a visible part of the classroom discourse, and to view such acts of initiative as valuable pedagogic moments. Thank you.